Hot Mic series, a special day. I've got two longtime friends, warriors in the housing finance, GSEs. 20% of US GDP comes down to housing. We're having an incredible bull run here in the housing market with lumber prices up over 140%, raging market. And so much of what happens in the housing market impacts inflation, impacts the Fed's decision making. But behind the scenes, there's a lot to Fannie and Freddie. And you're talking about government-sponsored enterprises that have just huge influence and have a lot to do with not only the economic cycle, but what happens behind the scenes and how Washington really works is just mind-blowing. I mean, over a decade ago, I started working with ACG Analytics in Washington. And each year, as you kind of get deeper into the Washington environment and learn about DC and how things really work behind the scenes and how the media works with some members of Congress and the White House, it's just unbelievable. It's a real eye opener, and that's the courage of Tim Pagliara. It's just it reminds me of when I wrote Colossal Failure, Common Sense. I mean, it takes a lot of courage. Our book's now in 12 languages. It's about the failure of Lehman Brothers, and Tim, the courage that he had to put this book together. It's really a tell-all on Fannie and Freddie, the government-sponsored enterprises, and the title is Another Big Lie, and it's got a great cover. The book does, and we're going to show it now. And Tim's also the CIO of CapWealth Management. And he's been a longtime friend, ally, and we shared ideas over the years. And I really appreciate him being here. But that's a great cover, Tim. I like the Statue of Liberty, Lady Liberty in handcuffs. But I think I'd like to bring in one of the most inspiring friends that I've had over the years is Gaby Heffesse. We've been friends since 2015, 16, and I hired her. It's my claim to fame.
2014, Larry.
I have to get that plug in. But I mean, she's done such an incredible job with ACG Analytics, running our team in Washington. She's been in so many different countries with our hedge fund clients around the world. She went to Athens 4 or 5 times during the Greek crisis. And has become really a veteran now in terms of Washington policy, how Washington policy impacts and has an impact on markets. And most recently, over the last year and a half, 2 years, the leadership that Gaby has put forth in this housing GSE story, Fannie and Freddie preferreds and equity, she's really become one of the top players in the space and made a number of really impressive directional calls that I'm very proud of. That to know her, she's made a lot of us some money from time to time, and we're grateful to you, Gaby.
Thanks, Larry. I mean, the GSEs has been one of the most fascinating topics that we have covered in the policy space, and really the curveballs that we've seen over the last decade in this space. And I know Tim can speak to this like no one else, and we kind of all lived it a little bit in his book. It's unlike any trade really I've ever seen. And I'm sure that's true for you, both of you as well. But I wanted, I read this book. I got really riled up again, Tim, because you read it and you just can't believe that this is what happened over the last decade. It was just hit after hit after hit. But before we get into more of the story, can we put into perspective how impactful the GSEs are? Like, how important are these in the overall economy, the housing market in the US? Let's start there. Let's put it in perspective.
First, thank you, Larry, for the intro. It's great to be with you this afternoon. I've been a big fan for a long time, and you, Gab. I guess you go all the way back to why the GSEs were created. 1938, you've got 50% drop in housing prices. You've got 25% unemployment. FDR and Henry Morgenthau are pulling their hair out trying to break the cycle, because in our banking system, and it's a system, it was created, it is a pro-cyclical business model. What happens when you go into an economic downturn? The regulators come in, they say, tighten up, don't make loans, get the loans off your books. And back then, housing was much different. The average home mortgage was less than 5 years. And so how do you requalify for a loan in that kind of environment, that kind of
Great point, Tim. Great point.
environment? And so they created Fannie Mae. And Fannie Mae went in, they bought these loans off the books of the banks, gave them liquidity, capital, and then they created the 30-year mortgage, because, and that, it ended a hole in the system. In Star Wars, you had the exhaust port in the Death Star. This has been part of what has created a very liquid secondary mortgage market since that time. Freddie Mac was created in 68 to provide additional liquidity for the savings and loan industry. And that's what the mission has been. So that's where it all started. And, in a policy environment, venom is always more contagious than vision. It's easier to tear down an institution like Fannie Mae and Freddie Mac, who, there was a lot of jealousy, a lot of things I go through in the book. They did a lot of things wrong. But at the same time, you got to have good policy. You've got to come up with an alternative, and they haven't found anything that's better. There is no substitute for the role that they play in the housing market. And so that's where it really starts.
I mean, the housing, owning a house in America, that is the fundamental American dream. That is kind of a basis of our society, which they allow and support to continue. And let's not forget, their balance sheet is $6 trillion. I mean, we talk about trillions today like they're nothing, but $6 trillion for two companies is still a lot of money and will move this economy and the housing market one way or another. It's
off the Fed balance, it's off the treasury, it's off the balance sheet, right, Gabby? So in other words, if Tim, correct me if I'm wrong, but if they go from conservatorship to receivership at any point in time, then you have to bring the $6 trillion onto the U.S. debt profile. Is that how it works, Gabby?
Exactly, and that's why they created this public-private partnership in the 60s, and Fannie Mae went public because they wanted this off the balance sheet. They wanted private capital to be, there to take the losses so that the American taxpayer was not at risk.
Right. But fast forward a bit. I mean, we're a bit ahead of here. We're not quite ready for this, Jose, but
we'll put it back. Yeah, we'll get it back when you're ready.
Yeah, absolutely. So fast forward, I mean, you could even, do you think, Tim, the government in a way pseudo-nationalized these entities, like nationalized them without saying that they were nationalized?
I don't think there's any question. They talk about, nationalization. We were off mic when we got started. I used the example. These guys thought they were Ethan Hunt, and they were running some kind of mission impossible of housing reform. Their emails didn't evaporate. I mean, it's there in black and white, whether it's Jim Parrott, Peter Wallison, Dave Stevens, they're all culpable in this process of shutting them down to serve their purposes.
And bring us back. What we're talking about, the summer of 2007, early 2008, I think, when they went to conservatorship, early 2008. Summer of
2008, Hank Paulson, then Treasury Secretary, they made the decision to put them in conservatorship, but they had planned it. And one of the the most troubling part about this, the first most troubling part, we'll say, is Hank Paulson sends them out to raise capital. Now, everybody can agree that the financial system is different today than it was in 2007, 2008. Banks have to hold more capital. Fannie and Freddie should have to hold more capital. No question about that. But you don't destroy them because you don't like the way their capital structure is. So he's forcing them to raise capital. So Fannie Mae, for example, they issued preferred. They issued a large series of preferred in November of 2007. they issued a large series of preferred in May of 2008. And you know the disclosure under federal securities laws. These are publicly traded companies. They disclosed everything till the cats came home. They didn't say anything about nationalization. They didn't say anything about conservatorship. And yet Jason Thomas is leaking a memo from Treasury to John Lang at Barron's, telling him and tipping him off, they're going to put him in conservatorship. That's the next step. John Lang writes a scathing front page article. He's got Morgan Stanley and Merrill Lynch in a box, acting like he's the one that's figured all this out. Well, it came directly from Treasury. And that's where it started. They were destabilizing these companies in the marketplace. At the same time, they were telling them to raise capital. In July of 2008, and I documented in the book the famous Eaton Park luncheon, in which Hank Paulson told members of the hedge fund community that they were going to put him in conservatorship. They were planning, all but told him. One of the people that attended that luncheon was so concerned, he got a legal opinion. He went to his lawyer, he got a legal opinion, and his lawyer told him, you have material, non-public information. You should not trade this. I mean, that's outrageous.
And in that moment, Hank Paulson chose winners and losers, because whoever was in that room knew exactly what was coming and nobody else did, not even the people at Fannie and Freddie.
But how about those individual investors and institutions that bought preferred shares in May of 2008?
My God. You imagine being, buying this offering of preferred shares, and then like 2 months later, you're down 50 cents on the dollar, right?
Nothing. Yeah, they got one interest payment, and that was it, and they've shut them down.
Wow.
Well, especially because when you go into Tim's book, Larry, you see that it shouldn't have been a bad investment. The numbers were there. It was okay. There was a rebound coming, and it did come. So, I mean, why did they put them in conservatorship? Were they just hated entities in Washington? Was it a backdoor bailout for the banks? Like, why was this so orchestrated? Do we know?
I think part of it was out of somewhat of a necessity. And I describe it in the book. Fannie Mae and Freddie Mac were like the Queen Mary and the Queen Elizabeth of the financial crisis. They had to have some mechanism that they could take charge of to solve the problem of private label mortgage-backed securities and the mess that the banks created.
Now, so for people that are watching us right now, discuss what the private label. That's companies issuing.
They issued their own mortgages. They were competing with Fannie Mae and Freddie Mac, and they were issuing their own, bundling their own mortgages. And as it was documented in the Financial Crisis Inquiry Commission, 92% of all the mortgages that went bad were issued by the banks, and less than 8% of them were issued by Fannie Mae and Freddie.
So back then, a private company could hire some bodybuilders, which I talk about in my book. Hire some bodybuilder mortgage brokers, sell a whole bunch of mortgages, and then just lay them off to Fannie and Freddie, and then make that spread over and over and over again.
Well, and they also kept a lot of them on their own balance sheets.
They have way more of the subprime market.
Right, and they were doing it with razor thin capital and risky mortgages. And so to Gaby's point, even in that environment, Fannie and Freddie had adequate capital. They survived, but for the fact that right after the conservatorship, Hank Paulson and Bernanke, they forced $187 billion worth of write-downs. They eliminated their deferred tax assets. They made them write down other mortgages like to zero. Well, nothing zero. If you followed the income statement of Fannie and Freddie all through from the crisis on, the income statement kept going up.
What's so funny that you really realize is that the government forced, by accounting manipulation, they forced them to seem like they were completely dead companies. But in that time, they thought they would be able to put them in receivership to basically nationalize them before they'd have to reverse the accounting. And then in 2012, they couldn't do it anymore. There's only so much that you can knock out DTAs, deferred tax assets, and these different mechanisms that they used. And then by the time they started being profitable, the numbers in 2012, they were enormous because you had all the backlog from the manipulation of the last 4 years. So what do? They're like, oh man, it's coming. They're going to be private again. We have to put in a net worth sweep to not let them have any earnings, because that 4 year of manipulation caught up with them. And that's when they put in the net worth sweep. So it's really unbelievable.
So let's simplify that. So 2010, the Obama team had a tough midterms. They lost 63 House seats in 2010. So 2011 is like a famous period because
Grover Norquist.
Yeah, exactly. And the
Budget Control Act of 2011.
The Budget Control Act. And this had a huge, to me, this was one of the first dominoes toward the 8-year deflation cycle that we lived through. And what I mean by that is that the sequestration of the summer of 2011, where the Obama team was head to head with the Republicans, which now controlled the House and very close to the Senate. And so the Republicans forced this austerity on the White House, vicious austerity. I mean, it had a big impact in terms of, I think the deficit in those years went from 1.1 trillion to 520 billion. So it was, just the complete opposite of today. I mean, we're increasing deficits. Back then they were taking them down viciously. And lo and behold, as Gaby said, that net worth sweep came in pretty handy, didn't it, Tim?
It did, and it was contrived. That deferred tax asset, and Tim Howard, he'll be cringing as I try and explain it, but a deferred tax asset gives you credit for taxes you're going to pay in the future. So if you write one down, like they did, like they forced them to do in 2008, you can't get it back. You're basically saying we're insolvent. We're never going to make any money again. But for the fact, and this is the United States Treasury, very few people know this. Mike Sicklin was the one that discovered it. September 28th, 2008, Treasury applied for a private letter ruling that was retroactive to the week before the conservatorship that allowed them to recover that deferred tax asset. So in August, and there's one other, in November of 2011, Treasury did a second deferred tax asset revenue application. And this one contemplated preserving the initial work that they had done with a variable dividend. And that variable dividend ended up being the net worth sweep. So now you go to August of 2012. They've got all of these problems, like you just outlined, with the Budget Control Act, with Grover Norquist.
And Tim, quick question. Fannie and Freddie are churning out $30 billion a year of profits.
They're still hiding those assets in non-cash charges and writing things down, but it had bubbled up, to Gaby's point, to where they couldn't hide it anymore. And so Susan McFarland briefs them along with Grant Thornton. We've got the notes, we've got her deposition, and she told Treasury they're entering a golden age of profitability. You can't hold them down anymore. We are going to have to write up this deferred tax asset. And less than 2 weeks later, they come up with the net worth sweep, where they're taking 100% of their earnings and profits in perpetuity because of this death spiral that they claim.
How much was that a year, Tim? How much was this? So they're sweeping from Fannie and Freddie, they're sweeping the profits over to Treasury. How much was that a year? Like 10 billion a year?
No, it's far more than that, because they wrote up that deferred tax asset in the first part of it, 3 months after they said they were in a death spiral. They've got to delay their year-end financials into the first quarter of 2013. And
by the time they started reporting, it was something like a $60 billion year or something crazy, because they had to catch up. So we're stabilized at $20 billion a year earnings. But in 2012, right after the net worth sweep, like the quarter after, we're seeing enormous amounts. Like I think it was 63 billion. I think it was something like that. Just insanity, because you're piling up all these years that they didn't need.
And they had to write it up in chunks. So Jack Lew, it was the point where Jack Lew sent a letter to John Boehner in April of 2013. And he said, hey, we've got an extra few months before this budget crisis unfolds. We'll get through to September because we've just found another $60 billion. Well, that $60 billion was the largest single dividend paid in the history of the world, the history of corporate America. It went to the government.
So Tim, if you're an investor in 2008, you buy this preferred in 2008, like this preferred second quarter, and then a couple of years later, they're sweeping all your dividends to Treasury. Is that how it happened?
That's exactly how it happened.
And
Yeah.
and they could, and basically they held back information that you should have had when you invested the money in 2008 when you bought the preferred. Oh my goodness.
Absolutely. And then they lied about it.
Yeah.
They lied about it. They filed a false affidavit in federal court. The first lawsuits were filed in June of 13. Mario Ugoletti, Treasury, said they were in a death spiral. And we know that's not true. That's perjury.
They got briefed. They literally got briefed beforehand to tell them, hey, we're about to have massive earnings. And then they went and testified that they were in a death spiral. I mean, this doesn't feel like America. I think that's the point where we're getting at, right?
That's right. And interesting, during that time period, I had spoken with Senator Corker from the fall of 2008 on. He called me. I was coming back from a client meeting, March of 2013. He said, why are these preferreds going up? And I said, Senator, it's like I've been telling you, these companies are inherently profitable. There were non-cash charges. They never should have been in conservatorship to begin with. You guys just didn't like the way they were structured. You got to come up with a different way. And he said, well, they wouldn't have made a dime if it wasn't for the federal government. I said, well, you could have said that about my Fifth Third investment that I paid $1 for. You could say that about any financial institution.
Right.
And that's when he and I really started bumping heads, and you started to see, my eyes started open about where the players were and why this was such bad policy and the different competing policy interests that shut them down.
And the Corker chapter was so scathing. I think it was one of the favorites in there, just wanting to champion an issue and really not being fair to all these people, and these pensions and all these entities that just had owned this equity in good faith. These are real people.
Bob Corker bet against America. Bob Corker had a net short position through the Pointer Hedge Fund, Abacus 18. The counterparty that was issued by Goldman Sachs, it's in the Federal Crisis Inquiry Commission. The counterparty to that credit default swap was AIG. Corker voted for the bailout of AIG. He essentially got his own bailout. And from Senate Ethics Disclosure, and Mark Warner was in this too, so this is bipartisan. They made between 25 to $50 million on that swap.
Yep.
At the same time, he was betting against the very system.
Now, remember, Abacus is the hedge fund. You're talking about the portfolio that was designed to short subprime mortgages. Is that famous?
Yes, it was a bet against housing. It was a bet on the downward spiral.
Famous is for the younger people watch this right now, but this was a big news story, like right around 2000. It finally came out, I think 2010, 9-10, the Abacus portfolio, which was designed, and I don't know if it was Goldman, there was a couple of banks that helped design this short vehicle that allowed some hedge funds and I guess Bob Corker to actually short the U.S. housing market in size, right?
Well, if you look at what was going on, everybody had these mortgage backs in their capital structure, in their portfolios. This was kind of like Archegos Capital, only everybody knew, and it was so permeated into their portfolios, they couldn't sell one or another. So Goldman created the Abacus hedge strategy to offload some of their risk to Europe so that they wouldn't so they could conceal it.
Like
Basically.
the scene in The Big Short. I love that.
Exactly. And they snuck in behind their other investors that, their other clients that they designed it for, which is also a real interesting tidbit when you look at the bailout of AIG and when they signed off. The day they signed off on that, the big investment banks got billions. But part of that agreement was they ended the liability. So AIG couldn't even go back to Goldman, couldn't go back to these other investment banks and sue them for the junk and the deception and the fraud that they had perpetuated on them. I mean, it is an amazing story of greed. Things that, just shocking. And that's why I had to write the book. I had to get, I had to get things out there in chronological order so people could actually see and experience this. It's too complicated otherwise.
Yeah, and it's an unbelievable story. We like to say it's the best quote unquote investment, though to stretch to call it that the U.S. has made since the Louisiana Purchase. They gave $187 billion. They've gotten back over $300 billion and potentially continues. I mean, I think the Obama administration was very comfortable with their $20 billion a year that just went into their slush fund.
The thing,
yeah.
Well, the thing that blows me away is that, both the Obama team and the Trump team bragged about their economic recovery, Obama and Trump. And you would think that if we're in such a great economic boom, all these years after Lehman, that you would think they would come out of conservatorship, but they've kept them in conservatorship, even though the Trump economy was raging strong, unemployment was down near 4%, but Fannie and Freddie are still in conservatorship. What's going on there?
It's a good point. And it's actually right now, it's working to the disadvantage of the American homeowner, because you've got Mark Calabria now as Federal Housing Finance Administrator. He's a student of housing reform. He knows this issue. He wrote HERA along with Michael Kriminger.
HERA's HERA, that was a famous act, the Housing Economic Recovery Act, right? HERA.
Right. Housing and Economic Recovery Act of 2008.
Okay,
that's what allowed the government to put them in conservatorship.
That's right.
It was a big bill.
So Mark understands that. Director Calabria understands that, and so he walks around, even in his confirmation hearing, he's got a dog-eared copy of the statute, and he understands that credit lines are not capital. His mission is to protect the American taxpayer. Well, you can't protect the American taxpayer in $6 trillion entities if they don't have capital. So what's happened, the unintended consequence of all of this, is that the average credit score of Fannie Mae and Freddie Mac is about 740 right now. They have no risk. Any of their loans that have less
high quality, very high quality portfolio.
Very, very high quality. 80% loan to value.
What, 680? And you need the average at Fannie and Freddie is 740. I mean,
yeah,
that's not supporting more home ownership, right?
No, so it's making it more difficult for people to get a loan because of the qualifications. Even private mortgage insurance on everything, 80%, unless they have a 20% down payment, they've got to have private mortgage insurance.
And let's simplify this a little bit. So $6 trillion for mortgage portfolio, and they really, the last 6-7 years, they haven't been retaining. Normally a company would produce profits and then retain the capital. And as they retain capital, they have more liquidity to lend. That's what a typical bank would do. But here they've been sweeping, as Gaby said.
Right. That ended, Larry. That ended in September of 2019 with the Trump administration.
Yeah.
So now they can at least retain their capital, although there needs to be another step forward to take them out of conservatorship, because the government still has their kind of first lien position. on
Yeah.
these.
So they just started retaining capital in 2019. So,
but
So they're
even
like
that retention of capital is somewhat illusory, because there's an offsetting increase in the liability for every dollar that they retain. And it's their way of controlling the exit of conservatorship. They are not going to allow them to build up a balance sheet until all the litigation is settled and the actual reform, the hard numbers on capital requirements and all of that. So it's, the government's not getting a credit for it on their balance sheet now. But at the same time, neither is Fannie and Freddie. It's kind of like in a state of suspended animation.
I sort of think it's better than at least it not being on their balance sheet. Despite the liability going up, I think and we should get into the litigation next, even though the liabilities are still going up, I feel better with the capital on Fannie and Freddie's balance sheet, even if it's just technically there and offset, than before. I think it is a major step forward.
I agree.
and once they're retaining capital for the progressive community and watching us right now, then they can open up the affordable housing trust funds and expand the credit box and make home ownership for for a larger group of people more affordable. Is that correct? Once they're retaining capital, then they can open up the affordable housing trust funds and then expand the credit box.
And the irony of this is that the government stands to make a lot of money on the recapitalization. They have warrants for 79.6% of the outstanding common. So the estimates are somewhere between 70 and $100 billion that they stand to make, that they could transfer immediately to a housing, affordable housing trust fund. But everybody's just, there's inertia. There's not any movement. And the court cases are part of it.
There's a problem, Larry, that you're hinting at, which is there's a problem with Black home ownership in America and minorities in America, because when we talk about affordability and accessibility, one thing we've seen is they are trailing their percent of the population. They are less likely to be homeowners. And this is, especially with this administration, these are the entities to tackle that issue with. This is where the affordable housing mandate in America comes from, and these are the entities to support it. But they need capital.
It's kind of a mind blower, if we're all thinking about wokeness and really, making things more, eliminating inequality. One would think that if you're focused on that you would do something about this, like you said, this incredible white-Black spread between home ownership. It's disgusting, and nothing's being done about it.
And I'm shocked that the Obama administration didn't even start to try to tackle this issue. But the good news is I feel like the day of reckoning is upon us a little bit, because in the next 2 years, we're seeing all the major litigation come to a head, starting with a case that's already in the Supreme Court, and the decision should come any day now. So
we have a big Supreme Court case that's up right now in the next 60 days, we'll get something.
Yeah. Yes. So Tim, we can put up the matrix a little bit. I can show ACG, there's two sides to this case, and it's really going on the net worth sweep that we talked about, kind of the 2012 act where they knew they were about to be profitable, so they took all the earnings. So there's two questions. It's a question on constitutionality, whether the director is even a constitutional entity. And the second part is, did it violate the Administrative Procedures Act to do the net worth sweep? And we can put our percentages up now. Tim, I'd love to hear your view. From the ACG view, is that the APA is really where we're highly confident that the plaintiffs will win, because when we heard the oral arguments, you really started hearing some of the things you talk about in the book, Tim, about, well, you basically nationalized them, and can you really do this? The justices seemed shocked by it. And
they were. And to your earlier point about, why Obama administration didn't do anything, well, they kind of had their cake and they ate it too, because they had not experienced a significant loss in the courts until the Fifth Circuit. And then secondly, they had a director that wasn't as concerned about capital issues. He just basically ran full out. And if you look at the two issues, the first one is the constitutional claim. Does the president have removal authority? Is it an at-will appointment? And the court's going to struggle with that a little bit. And courts have a tendency to take the easier path, even though they got to make a tough decision. And it's very easy to do it with the Administrative Procedures Act.
Well, let's just simplify it a tiny bit.
Yeah.
So you have the separation of powers. You have the executive branch and Congress, and then the Supreme Court. So Baron de Montesquieu, 300 years ago, the Frenchman designed this system of the separation of powers, checks and balances, and it's one of the reasons why this Republic of the United States of America has been able to be so successful relative to other republics or democracies for the last 400 years. So this is an important separation of powers is important. Now, this case applies to President Obama and his appointees, and then Congress's ability to neutralize them. What is you just get into the separation of powers and the executive branch powers relative to what Congress is trying to maybe take away and whatnot.
David Metzner has a great saying. He says, and I cover it in the book too, every once in a while, Congress tries to create a fourth branch of government. And that's exactly what happened with this legislation. They wanted to create a piece of legislation that was exempt from judicial review. It was exempt from executive branch authority. And actually, they were trying to control from the grave. They were trying to keep future legislative action, future Congress.
Tim, let me just expand on one point you just made before I let you continue. Larry, they literally put in the law that as conservator, they're not suable. They basically can do whatever they want. They took away the power of the justice. They took away the power of the president. I mean, it's unbelievable the exertion by Congress in the structure of FHFA, the regulator.
Right. So they're trying to create these independent agency because they want to remove this from the political process. And yet it's as political as it gets because Mel Watt, for example, violating every part of the APA known to man, every statutory thing that has to do with conserving and protecting assets, which is that's the primary role of a conservator, protect and conserve assets. And President Obama didn't care because he was able to continue on. He had money for his deficit, for his pet projects. And so the government, and I want to read this section. We can unpack it a little bit. It's from Judge Willett. In his opinion, and this is what really got it started. He said, I cannot endorse such a willy-nilly delegation of authority to an administrative entity impervious to meaningful judicial review. The FHFA's professed power is something special, so spacious, it's specious. In terms of unfettered clout, the FHFA has no rival across the federal agency landscape. But unfettered must never be unfretted. Agencies must always operate within the carefully crafted statutory schemes that govern their existence. And that's why I think, Gab, you guys believe, and I think most of the people that have followed this believe that the court is going to come down really hard on the Administrative Procedures Act. That they were not following the statute. Right. Conserve and protect does not mean taking 100% of the earnings and profits of corporation in perpetuity. You know, we were all gaslighted into believing that that was possible. And it was kind of a tripwire. You know, Judge Lamberth, and we'll talk about his case a little bit too in context. Judge Lamberth set this train rolling on the basis of the perjured affidavit of Mario Ugaletti that said they were in a death spiral. He would have had a totally different way of looking at this, in my opinion.
Exactly.
If they told the truth.
Yeah, he was acting back then when he made that big decision on bad information.
So,
right?
so we went for years.
Out, right? And the case is coming back up. And I would imagine he's a little bit pissed off that they lied.
If I were him, I would be
federal
pissed.
judge.
I'll never forget the day I think I was with you and David Metzner in New York at Harlow having dinner, and the decision hit the tape. And that was, I mean, the preferreds. You know, one thing about this trade is these preferreds and the equity, and that's why you need a firm like ACG on your side, because news headlines come out, they're very noisy, and the fast money gets knocked out of the trade. I've seen this happen literally with this trade 30 times. So news headline comes out, Judge Lambert rules this way, preferreds drop like 40, 50%. And then we find out over the next several months that the headline was nowhere near as bad as it was perceived, and the trade normalized. That has happened literally almost 20 times, and that's why, Gaby, I really appreciate your work. But if the Treasury loses this case, if the government loses this case, this June case in the Supreme Court, I've heard is it $100 billion at worst case the Treasury could lose?
It's more. It's 125. And as you saw with our matrix, like we have them at maybe like just under 90% chance of losing. Like this is a really tricky part for the government. And
Janet Yellen's
just on one case, there's two other very good cases coming up all in the next year, which I think are worth kind of getting your perspective on, Tim, on the Lamberth case specifically, because that's a good one.
Yeah, the Lamberth case is set for trial in May of next year. And after the case was remanded back to him to consider the contract rights of the preferred shareholders. And essentially what the government did as these profits rose, you know, you own preferred shares in a company for a reason, because it's got a preference. It's ahead in the capital stack. And they just decided not to make any interest payments. They've kept them basically in an insolvent position for all of these years. And so it's like you and I just deciding we're not going to pay our American Express bill. You know, you can't do that. And it's contractually, they're bound to do it within certain limits. And so the government has to answer a single count of whether or not they comported with the embedded provision in every contract that you act with good faith and fair dealing. Right. And that's, Lamberth decided that's what they're going to do at the trial court level. That was very passive aggressive. And to me, he, in a very nice way, said, I'm pissed.
He also, I mean, the government has asked for extensions and he's like, no. The day has come. We are keeping it as is. You get no more time. I mean, because everything we're getting is really indicating that's going to be a tough one, an even tougher one for the government. But Larry, we're in this place right now where, you know, in historical standards, we're at a decently low prices for both the pref and the common, and we have all these catalysts coming up, and it's really, I mean, amazing, because what Tim did is kind of outline what happened since 2008 and really, you know, the early 20th century from the inception, but really the last decade. And you see how it's all culminating now in these cases. And it's just this perfect window.
It is. We had a couple of conference calls with David Thompson, you know, the lead litigator, Cooper and Kirk. He's done a magnificent job, brilliant mind. And he outlines in the Lamberth trial case a $12 a share damage model. So, you know, if we prevail in Lambert's court, the preferred shareholders would get $25 plus $12 in damages on proving that the government didn't comply with good faith and fair dealing, that they intended essentially to defraud the shareholders. And like David says, I've got the evidence. The facts are on my side, and that's the whole chronology of all the things we talk about in the book. So it's not just this Supreme Court ruling that'll be out in the next 60 days. It doesn't end the litigation. It more than likely just strengthens the existing litigation, which I think you might want to talk about the letter agreement and what Treasury Secretary Mnuchin did before he left office, because I think it ties in. They recognize that letter agreement that he left office with, for the first time, I think, acknowledge the importance of the litigation, because they make it a condition precedent that it's all settled before
Right.
they recapitalize.
And the other thing I think Mnuchin did, which was big, is in that other past administrations have been comfortable printing that check. They're not getting it anymore. They're getting it kind of in kind on a liability, but they're not actually getting any money. It does encourage action in two ways. A, there's no way to profit off of these, at least not for the Biden administration, unless you act. And B, you have to settle the litigation if you want to move forward. And like we've said, this is a key to affordable housing and affordability, accessibility. I mean, it should all fall in line. And I think as these cases continue, it will put pressure on the government to settle and really move forward. I mean, receivership is not in the lexicon anymore.
So if we really care about inequality, okay, and inequality is skyrocketing in the post-COVID era. I mean, it's just off the charts. So you would think if we really care about inequality, that we would want to expand the credit box for African-American home ownership. And the problem is, I'm just listening to you and I'm following this. But the problem is, in order to do that, these cases potentially need to be settled with investors. And then once you settle, then you can recap and release them. And then they can open up the affordable housing trust funds. Is that pretty much it?
The key is capital. You need capital. And in order to unlock capital and have a future, you need to settle. And in order to settle, you need to take the government stake out of their senior position, which they shouldn't even be in to begin with.
And that means by raising capital, you mean a lot of times with distressed companies, and when I was at Lehman, we did this with Delta Airlines and Northwest. The company goes into bankruptcy and then they come out and raise capital and sell shares or sell new preferreds, and you have a whole new company. In this case, it's like going into conservatorship and then coming out with a capital raise. Is that what you're talking about over the next year and a half?
Or sooner, if this could move very quickly if the court acts decisively and they create the environment for settlement. One of the calls with one of the plaintiff's attorneys, and I would classify them as constitutional scholars, they talked about how important it probably is for the court. They want to be as decisive as they can in this Collins case so that this can move forward. They want to create the environment to settle it once and for all. They won't be able to settle everything because it'll more than likely have to be remanded back to trial for damages and other things depending upon how they rule. But that would set the stage. Then the next big argument that's going to take place is how much capital is necessary. There's two camps. One I would classify as Dr. Calabria's, where he wants higher capital requirements than what other people in the industry think are necessary. The stress tests showed that a 2.5% capital ratio is adequate. They're at 3 to 4, and it'll be settled. And it should be, because these are very profitable entities, especially in the environment that we're in right now with, where like to your point the other day, future streams of cash flow are starting to look a lot less attractive in an inflationary environment. Pay me now.
Pay me now, baby. Pay me
Wait
now.
10 years. Yeah.
Present value. So Tim, Investors Unite, you started it and it really demonstrated the retail investors in this trade. And so I think it's important to highlight that, because one of the things we need to dispel, and it's just not true, is the quote unquote, you talk about this, the hedgy narrative. This isn't just a hedge fund trade. There are real people in this. This matters.
There always have been. And it was a very convenient way for them to pile on, where they accused a bunch of greedy hedge funds of trying to profit off of this trade. Well, the law is the law. It doesn't matter. And so in order to put a face of the individual investor, forward, we created Investors Unite, and we brought people from all over the country. We had a big impact in derailing Corker Warner and Crapo Johnson, some of the bad policy legislation that would have shut Fannie and Freddie down in favor of a big bank-centric model. And I think that the impact of that still exists. There's policemen, there's firemen pension funds, there's individual investors. But some of the largest investors right now, if you look at the 13F filings, like Capital Group, they're not a hedge fund, they're individual investors. Bruce Berkowitz, his average account was $30,000. You got Mr. Berkeley with his insurance company. These are just investors that have property rights that need to be honored. And part of that just has to happen also before they'll be able to attract new capital. Right. Some of these people that still own these shares in their 13F filings, they will be the largest sources of capital in the recapitalization and release, because they understand and they believe in the housing mission, the liquidity mission that Fannie and Freddie have in the secondary mortgage market. They like the business model.
Right. So, there's real people. We have some catalysts. We have SCOTUS. We have Lamberth. It's just about dealing with those senior prefs and getting to that 2.5% requirement, which, it's 4% on paper, but really we want to get to that 2.5, because then there's a buffer area. And it shouldn't, people have gone in and want to be invested in these capitals. There's some real money funds, which they say, deal with this and we'll be there. We'll be there with the capital. It sounds like a lot. It's just over 200 billion, but there's
200 billion that they need. 200 billion.
Yeah. I mean, it changes, but it's over that. I think it's 2.5%. I mean, it's very important to not get fooled by that 4% number. Right. And they'll get there. And don't forget, if you do get the liquidation preference away, they already have more than 50 billion. And by the time you deal with it, they'll probably have 70. So, every day there's less dilution, as long as you settle and deal with this and allow for those contractual rights and write down the senior preferred shares. That's really the key. And it's very simple.
So get back to that. So that's the senior preferred shares is the government stake.
The government stake.
So right now they're first in line. And then if you write those down, then the preferreds that are outstanding are worth more. Is it?
Sure.
Yeah, they've been paid back. The government's been paid back.
Yeah. I mean, like we said, 187, and then they got 300. I mean, it's 10% and then some, 30 billion over, and forget about the liquidation preference that's going up with the money that they're retaining. I mean, I don't even get us started with that, because I think, blood pressure might go up, but it's easy to solve, really. I mean, it should be.
A short story about, it was December of 2008. We were at the bottom of the housing crisis. And I later found out, as I told you, Bob Corker bet against America. And I was a trustee of a high school here in Franklin, Tennessee, in my community. And 3 of the other trustees, we got together and I said, look, guys, let's make a restricted gift to the school, put it in the endowment fund, And we bought $1 million face value of Fannie Mae preferreds at 95 cents a share. One of those trustees is already deceased. That's how long this has been going on, almost 13 years. When these go to par, we're going to take that $1 million and name a scholarship fund after him. People have waited too long. We have to restore credibility, to property rights, the rule of law, and the Supreme Court, I think, is going to act decisively to put us down.
And that's what has separated the United States. And Buffett, every couple of years, I used to go to that Buffett and Munger, the annual meeting in Omaha for Berkshire Hathaway. And, they've said over and over again why they're so concentrated in the United States. It's the rule of law, it's property rights. And
if you believe in that, this is your bet. If you believe in America and that they'll do the right thing and they won't continue down the path of what we've seen for the last 13 years, this is for you. If and I mean, my personal favorite branch is the judicial branch. So I'm hoping it's the one that pulls us through.
And how do you get property rights in please simplify what this means around property rights?
Go ahead, Gab. I'll let you.
Well, look, I think it goes back to, I think it's in 1932 when you have the Stock Act that basically gave contractual rights to equities. And I think there's an expectation in an investment in the country and in an investment in certain corporations that you are an equal participant against whoever steps in, especially if it is the government, and that you have rights for a contract that you had. And you can't, there was a contract violation that happened, and there was an orchestration, I think that's a word, but by the government and there's a paper trail. And I think that's what Tim outlined so beautifully. There's a paper trail of the government intentionally stepping in and violating these contracts. So I think the real tenet of property rights was violated by the U.S. government here. So and I think that's what we're going to see.
One of the things I talk about in my book is Philosophy of Common Sense and Tim and I have talked about this, but there was a clear period of time of about 60 days or so in those dark days of the financial crisis where it's sad to say, when you peel back the onion and you get inside of this, the U.S. was essentially a dictatorship. The rule of law, the process, property rights was all thrown out the window, and that's what this book's all about. And it's a great read. Thank you, Tim, for putting it together. Gosh, it's a lot of work.
Yeah, it's very simple to me. I mean, we all have that image of the guy that stood in front of the tank at Tiananmen Square, and our securities laws, our property rights, they don't distinguish between somebody owning 1 million shares or 500,000 shares. That one share, that individual that has one share of Fannie Mae has the same property rights under the law as Bill Ackman or anybody else. And that needs to be respected. And I think the court will see that. My favorite Churchill quote is, "You can count on Americans to do the right thing after they've tried everything else." And believe me, they've tried everything in the last 13 years. And, it's coming down to the final decisions.
I couldn't agree more.
And is that any closing remarks? Any kind of big points you want to make in terms of the next, say, 60 days? I guess we're waiting on the Supreme Court, but as you guys beautifully laid out, there's a number of cases that have been going on for years, and this case could get remanded. This case could be settled. If it's settled, Janet Yellen has to write a $120 billion check.
Or write down the seniors and write no check.
Write no check.
That's right. And
it's a hugely important point.
It's a great point.
I would just, I'd end by saying to the individual investors, the people that, brought together Investors Unite, be patient. This is going to work. I hate the idea that people give up, at the end. The internal rate of return on this is going to be phenomenal for the people that are coming to the tail end of it, at current prices, because these should not be priced where they are right now, given all the positive.
To Gaby's point, like years ago when we were in this trade in 2015, 2016, it was like a long option, like a warrant, right? So the trade was, the equity and the preferred were essentially like a long-term warrant. And I think the point you're making, Gaby, is that time is now compressed, right? So we have this,
but we're still at an option pricing, which is what's kind of unbelievable about it. Like we might have the pathway for the end of this in the next 60 days, or at least the beginning of the end, because Supreme Court, yes, they'll remand it, but they'll remand it with guidelines, and we'll really see kind of the threshold and the burden of proof that the plaintiffs need. And my feeling is that they will already have proven that to a certain degree, and that trial is almost just a motion.
And when do we think the Biden team's going to put in, so they're going to replace Mark Calabria? Was it a Trump appointee? You would expect the Biden people to replace him?
Yeah, I would guess so. As long as the court says it's unconstitutional, I would imagine the Biden team wants to put their own people in. It's how most presidents go. You don't want to keep the Trump people around. But we'll see. I mean, we'll see what happens.
But on that matter, if you really want to expand the affordable housing trust funds, increase African American home ownership, if you're in the Biden team, your appointee there, if I were them, I would want someone that was working with Fannie and Freddie, retaining capital, expanding the credit box, and that sounds like your mission. Like that sounds like a good thing.
I mean, Fannie and Freddie investors are aligned with the progressive community here.
Yeah,
they all want capital. I could even see a new, this administration bringing down the capital requirements, if anything, to make it easier to get there and start opening up those lines. Yeah. So I don't think we're in an antagonistic administration for the end goals.
Yeah, that's how I want to make clear. That's a great point. Great point. It's very important. This is investors and progressives and inequality, to end inequality, or not end it, but really let's make things, let's take it from very bad to less bad to hopefully more equality. Investors are aligned with progressives. But great presentation, and we appreciate the time. Tim, let's as I tell my wife as a former Lehman trader, if we sell 1 million books, we'll break even on our Lehman stock. So I hope he sells 1 million books as well.
I hope he sells 1 million books, but has the stock pay for itself and not need the book sales.
I'm donating 100% of the gross proceeds to my foundation, and I've got a school in Tanzania that started 20 years ago, and we certify teachers in science and math. 4,300 students now.
Wow!
And, it's full-fledged university, so that's where the money's going.
Wow.
And I'm not quitting my day job because, as you know, there's a whole lot of money in being an author.
That's great. Well, you make more money on the speaking tour than you do writing the book. That's for sure. So we got to get you on the speaking tour. Hope anybody watching this right now, Tim Pagliara, you got to have him at your next event. But
all right.
Take care.
Thank you.
Bye, guys. Okay.
Bye. Thanks.